Okay guys, I'm gonna do this instructional just a little bit differently. I want you guys to see it's sort of a detailed view of this head drawing while I do it. So I videoed this on my iPad. Since I did a standing demo last time, you already know the materials are the same, the process is the same. We're just looking intricately at the face. So right now you can see basically I am laying out the general shapes, right? So I'm starting with an oval, keeping it really basic. Again, I'm trying to make sure it's dark enough that you can see, but also still keep it pretty light. And you can kind of see I started to put in some guidelines on the face. So I like to do a plot line that's kind of curved. It gets a little bit of the angle of the face. Again, the eyes are at the halfway point. So although they're going to look like they're a lot higher, you have to try not to make them too high because that'll end up with her face too long. So when we look at the head in its totality from the crown of the head to the chin, the eyes are going to be at the halfway point. The nose is going to be then halfway between the eyes and the chin. And that top lip is going to fall, if you divided between the nose and the chin into 3 spaces, that top lip is going to fall at the top third. So there should be 1/3 between the nose and that top lip, and 2/3 from that lip to the bottom of the chin. So sometimes the angle of a person's face can throw those dimensions off. We're looking at her directly frontal view, so we can kind of work with those measurements. Okay, so you see, after I do a general circular shape, I get myself a few guidelines. This is where you start plotting in where the hair is. You want to make sure to keep an eye on how far down the hairline is to the top of the crown. You want to kind of start to refine the shape of the face, refine the shape of the ear. Don't forget the ears, they are very important. We can't really see the second ear because we have a slightly different angle on the face. Okay, so basically once you have the shape situated, I go back and get my eraser. I clean this up just a little bit, and then I'm going to pick up the charcoal. So what's really important here, very much like the figure, is we want to start with a 2-value statement. And notice I didn't use line to draw out the eyeballs. I didn't use line to draw out the bottom of the nose, and you'll see why. So this is a chiaroscuro technique. And what's important about this technique is that we are just looking at the shadow shapes to create these features. So squint when you look at the reference, that'll help. You don't want to worry about all the little details. So right now I'm doing the 2-value statement, right? So I'm doing a very soft shading in generally the same value all over all shadow areas of the face. So they're all going to kind of link together. I want to look at the one big shadow shape that this whole network of shadows sort of builds together. So this is sort of where you start dropping in. I do right underneath the top lip because that casts a shadow, and that's all going to connect over the bottom lip and then under to the chin. So this, typically take your time, keep this really soft because you're going to have to do a lot of editing. I've had a lot of practice kind of looking at shadow shapes, so it takes some time to really pay attention to just the shadow areas. This is where those negative space practice that we did, this is kind of where this comes in. Because we sort of want to leave open some of the areas, or at least we don't want to cover them too deeply where there's light. And we want to, drop in that single value statement everywhere there's shadow. And you'll notice I kind of work in the cast shadow as well. So this 2-value statement is sort of just a soft overdrop of these shadow shapes. What's going to be interesting is as we start to want to create the features out of these shadow shapes, this is where the difference between a cast shadow and a form shadow comes into play. So we know the cast shadows make those really hard lines, and we can see some below the nose, and we can see some that go across the eye that are sort of cast by the brow. And you can see me starting to drop in these darker, harder shadows. This is the best place to start. So this is sort of the next step is to start looking for those hard edge shadows. Those are the ones that give us a more significant area to focus on right at first to start creating the shapes of the features. So as we start creating these features, you'll see me go back and forth and do a lot of adjustments. So you guys see this. This isn't quite in real time. Real time, this took me about an hour. And so I've sped it up a little bit just so you don't have to be there forever. But you'll see as I start creating more of these shadow areas, I'll go back and forth a little bit. So I start looking for the darkest areas at this point. This is where we start to refine the forms, and they're not always perfect right off the bat. You'll see me, I'll have to go back in with the eraser a little bit here and there. But this is where you start to really refine those shapes, and you're using still soft shadows, right? You're not using line right now. You're still focusing on the shapes of these shadow areas. What's a cast shadow? What's a form shadow? What creates those features? You'll realize right now you can still see the plot lines, right? I still know sort of where the tops of her eyes are. I know where the end of her nose is. You can kind of start to erase those out in a little bit once you've sort of worked out the right spots. So a lot of this is going really slow. Take your time. This isn't something that you want to speed through. I would take this step by step. I would do your base form. I would do your two-value statement, and then I would give it a break, and I would come back and look at it later. That's one thing you'll notice with portrait drawing is you'll think everything's straight, and then you'll walk away, and you'll come back, and you'll realize the eyes are at different levels. You'll see me kind of work on that a little bit here. I have a little bit more of a head tilt maybe. It's a little more dramatic than it is in our model. But you'll see some slight differences when you step away for a minute and come back. So I think that that's really important to attend to or to keep in mind, is that you want to stand back from your work quite frequently as well. When you're up close, everything's going to look like it lines up. If you take a few minutes and step back at some point, you'll notice that there are definitely going to be some discrepancies. So you're going to keep continuing to add in these shadows. I'm still looking at the cast shadows or the darkest areas of the core shadows. That's what's going to define these features. And you can sort of see where there's cast shadows from her eyelid. That's what gives us the shape of the eye. Since she doesn't have a pupil, because this is just a plaster face, we don't have that to concentrate on. So we're really just looking at light and form. And so where I'm darkening areas, those are the areas I see where I can find shadows. So don't think of her eyeball or her eyelid as an eye. Think of it as a sphere, right? So that's how that light is going to sort of cross that form. And the eyelid is sort of a covering of that sphere. So it's going to have a little shadow underneath the edge that casts. So we have to think about all of these features as three-dimensional shapes. And that's sort of what's going to help us describe them. And portrait drawing, there's always some adjustment, right? And that's sort of why we start to go in with shadow forms over line, because what happens is this becomes a lot more easy for me to adjust as I build these, right? I'm building them slowly. I start to see problems more easily. You'll see I work on the nose quite a bit because as you start to come out of the two-value statement and you start to build dimension by using these shadow shapes, this is where you'll start to see things if they don't fit, or if they're crooked, or if they're, not the right measurement. So at this spot, it seems a little slow. What I'm doing is I'm going back and forth. You'll see I'm on the eraser right now, and I'm sort of fixing some of those measurements. So her eyelid has a certain width above her eye, and then she has a certain amount of shadow width that's taken up from underneath her brow, right? So she's got her forehead, then her eyebrows, and then she has this sort of ridge that dips back, and then her eyelid sort of comes out from that. So I took a minute to remeasure a couple of those things, make sure I was on the right track. Now I'm doing the same thing with the nose. So now I'm going to go back and forth a little bit with the nose. I'm going to add some shadow shapes. I started losing the overall value of the nose. So what I did here is I started looking at how does the shadow shape from the entire nose go down across the lips and connect, because that's what I want to keep accurate. That's what's going to give me this overall shape. So I sort of made sure that I had that accurate, and then that's going to help guide me to a more successful nose. So what I'm paying attention to right here is the distance between the bottom of her nose and the top of her upper lip. At the position she's at from the camera, that actually seems pretty long. So sometimes you'll see that look a little bit shorter. So a lot of this is kind of double checking with sight measuring, where we put our highlights, if we need to lengthen or shorten an area. So you're going to see me sort of go back and forth with this shadow area right here for a minute. One thing you always want to be double checking too are the angles and where the ends of her mouth should fall. So one thing you need to take into consideration is the measurement between the edge of her mouth and her jaw, how much space should be between there. You also want to check the amount of space that's between the edge of her mouth and her nose. So if you compare those to make sure that they're accurate, that's going to help make sure that mouth falls in the right position. You can do it on the other side as well. That side's a little more lost in shadow. And it's okay to lose some of these areas in shadow a little bit, right? You'll see her nose sort of blends in some areas. What we can see, what defines the nose, are the areas of reflected light underneath, and that's where we can see the nostrils, right? The shadow's darker in the nostrils. We have some cast shadow, and then the reflected light sort of gives us that feeling of 3-dimension. We want to make sure not to make that too light. It's still in the shadow area. It's still not going to be as light as anything on the light side. But those are the things that help start to give us this dimension. So now I'm at the point where I'm starting to go throughout the rest of the face and make sure that I have those areas of shadow or form a little more correct. Again, this is a constant adjustment, so you don't want to go too permanent with any of your movements, even at this stage. You want to take your time. You really want to keep just building those shadow areas softly. This is one of those points where I'm restructuring the eye a little bit. You can see I'm adding more detail of the shadow underneath the eye, kind of going back and forth between. You also want to make sure your eyes aren't too close together. You should be able to fit the width of a third eye in between both of them, right over top of the nose. That's a measurement to check. Make sure they're not too close, make sure they're not too far away. When I'm double checking the eyes, another thing I also check is the distance from the corner of the eye to the edge of the face. So in this case, she has the edge of her cheekbone, and then she has the corner of her eye, and you want to make sure that that distance is correct. So make sure it's not too wide, make sure it's not too narrow. Okay, this is another point you'll see. I'm back on the eraser. So what I'm doing here is I am touching up. So I'm double checking those measurements. Do I have enough room for the eyelids? Can you see the areas that I'm going to add the white pencil well enough? This is where I'm starting to clean it up a little bit. So it seems kind of slow. It's kind of hard to tell where I'm at. But basically I'm just kind of rechecking, reevaluating, cleaning up, sort of making sure I feel like everything's correct. Now I'm sort of adding in a lot more of the cast shadow. And this is where, don't forget the neck area. I know she's, a bust on a block. You can draw the block. You don't have to draw the block. You can stop at the bottom of the neck like I'm doing. I'm going to darken the cast shadow next to her. At some point, I'm actually going to blend this off into a background, but for right now, you can sort of see this cast shadow area just to keep yourself on track. And it drops down over the block. I'm not going to worry about that part of it too much. I just want to make sure it's, we kind of get that feeling that she is 3-dimensional and she is casting a shadow. So this is where, don't forget the hair area, right? We still have that form to describe. We still have to save areas for reflected light, which is just going to be a little bit lighter versus the darker cast and core shadows. So at this point, I'm kind of feel like I'm refining. So I'm going to go over the hair, and then I kind of go back across the face a little bit just to make sure that my open areas look right. So I'm looking at the shadow areas, but another thing I'm also going to check, for example, the light area that's on the right side of her face, the triangle sort of shape that's underneath her eye. If I look at that just as a shape that connects over top of her eye, I want to make sure that feels relatively correct in size and shape. That's another thing that can tell me if I'm on track or not. It's still pretty easy to make adjustments right now because I don't have any super hard lines, right? I can still shift a few things. So now I'm picking up our light tone. So this is the first time you're going to be able to see me bring in highlights. So what I'm going to do with the highlights is I'm going to go in pretty soft, just like I do the shadows. I'm going to start with the areas where the light is hitting the brightest and where those cast shadows need to be defined. So I started in her ear. I'm sort of going to work my way over. So her eyelids are the next really important area. Around her eyes are some of the areas where we can really emphasize certain highlights to bring that out. So you'll see right now I'm going through and I'm doing what I think are the most significant highlight areas. So I'm paying close attention to just those brightest points right now. All right, and I'm sort of dropping those in and I'm going to build these values. So now as I bring in the light charcoal or the white charcoal, this is where you can start to see the form, right? And you might actually also start to recognize some concerns. So I will go back to the charcoal pencil or the eraser, kind of switch back and forth just to do some minor tweaks. But before you start the light, you should be pretty happy with your portrait overall. So definitely when you're going to turn in progress, please turn in progress at the 2-value statement or before you get to the light areas, right? Because we can still make a few adjustments. You'll notice I don't want to color her in solidly, right? I don't want to make every part of that light area white. I want to let this gray tone paper work. These are all of the mid-range values. That means I don't have to create those. I'm looking for just those areas that light really pinpoints off of. That's what's giving me that dimension. Okay, I can use it to highlight lips. I can use it to highlight the edges of the lips that are catching the light versus the shadow areas. This will really give the nose a lot of dimension. The softer curves on her cheeks, you'll see that I keep those areas pretty soft, especially on that one side of her lip. This is how you can really start to define the form. So you want to take this one just as slow as you do the charcoal. You want to take this very carefully. You want to hit it a lot harder. You want to be stronger in your highlights on the brightest points. So those brightest points are going to be like the end of her nose. You'll have some highlights along her lips. Just on those spots, you'll see the very edge of the bottom lip is really bright. This is where you can really emphasize those facial features. You'll have a little bit of a highlight typically on a forehead, some in her hair, but you don't want to color it solidly or else you'll lose that quality where that light sort of adds that dimension. The final part of the stage that I want to speak to, and you'll kind of see it now is where you see me going back and forth, right? So I added the light in most areas that I think this gives me a pretty good idea, and I can tell, her eyes feel a little bit off. One feels smaller. I don't have my shadow shapes exactly right. I felt like there was a hard edge on her brow ridge. So now you're going to see me go back and forth just a little bit. And this is me tweaking this to feel like I have these shapes correct. I'm going to go in her hair, with her eyes, and I'm kind of going to start to tweak these shapes a little bit so that I feel like this is a little bit more of an accurate representation of the head itself. So what I'm going to do is pay really close attention to exactly where those shadows are. That's why you see me zoom out just a little bit. I can get a better view overall of that. And you'll see me go back and forth with the eraser. Of course, that'll kind of soften any areas, lighten them if I have too much charcoal, kind of bring those white highlights down a little bit. I'll go back in with the charcoal pencil, and then at the very end, I'll hit it again with some extra highlights once I feel like I'm a little more accurate.